Welcome back to MLL 400, the literature of travel in the 20th century. Where had we left off last week? We had, of course, talked about Moriogai, that giant of the literary scene of Meiji Japan, and his travels to Germany. And of course, we had focused on the story Maihime, or the Dancing Girl, which is a fictionalized account of what maybe had happened to him in Germany. And we had, of course, asked a bunch of questions, three of which I think are particularly interesting because they connect us to this week's theme, or at least they will allow us to maybe connect some of the questions we're talking about this week to last week's readings. So the questions had been, is the story Maihime a tale of the compromise and defeat of a newly liberated youth by the oppressive forces of a feudal tradition, a chronicle of the birth and premature stifling sense of individualism and self-awareness of the Meiji intellectual that was triggered by his trip to Germany? Next, does Moriogai tap into transnational literary currents like Sturm und Drang, Romanticism, the I novel, and to what degree is he in dialogue with literary currents in Germany? And finally, is it a reversal of Madame Chrysanthème and a challenge to the orientalizing narratives that perpetuate Western fantasies about Japan or about the Orient or the Far East or just the other? Today, we are switching continents yet again, and we find ourselves in Germany, maybe / Switzerland. And we're talking about Hermann Hesse, 1877 to 1962. So you see, he's a generation younger than Moriogai. He is a very well-known German language writer, one of the most important of the 20th century, really. He was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1946. And if you're not familiar with him or his writing, maybe you could ask your parents, or maybe even your grandparents, because Hermann Hesse was very, very well known and very well received in this country, in the United States, in the 1960s. He was part of that, the Beat generation, the counterculture, and I say a little bit more about that later on. Hermann Hesse was born into a staunchly Protestant, Lutheran family. His grandparents actually had been missionaries, Protestant missionaries in India. And he sort of grew up in an environment, he was sort of surrounded by a lot of, sort of artworks and objects that his grandparents had brought back from India. His mother actually had been born in India. His grandfather, on his mother's side, the father of his mother, had, while in India and probably afterwards, compiled a grammar of the Malayalam language. I guess that was the language of the part of India where they were stationed, and had actually assisted in translating the Bible into that language. So during his youth, Hermann Hesse was really exposed to that intellectual curiosity in Eastern mythology, philosophy, even language of his grandfather. But he also suffered under the household's extreme pietism, religiosity. And, it was expected of him to follow, really, that route and to become a theologian. And he eventually entered the Evangelical Theological Seminary of Maulbronn Abbey in 1891, one of the most famous religious schools, boarding schools in Germany. And he was clearly a very gifted student, but he really didn't like it there, and he suffered tremendously. The hierarchy, the expectations, sort of the stifling of his own individuality, his personal ideas, and he experiences a serious personal crisis that actually leads to an attempted suicide. He eventually leaves that educational environment and becomes an apprentice with a bookseller in Tübingen, a famous German university town, and he really immerses himself in literature and philosophy, especially of the German Romantic period. And he eventually begins his own literary career, which was to remain characterized maybe by some of those romantic ideals, very much characterized by an existentialist quest, a sense of yearning, self-fulfillment, and also, very important, this fascination with Eastern mysticism and religion. And the two works that he's probably best remembered for are a novel called Siddhartha from 1922, which really taps into that, especially Indian mysticism, Buddhist ideas, Hinduist ideas. And then there's another novel which, again, I think your parents or your grandparents might have heard of, you might want to ask them, is Steppenwolf, which again is sort of very much characteristic of this yearning, not so much this time in the East, more a journey of the self. In 1911, Hermann Hesse, together with a close friend of his, the painter Hans Sturzenegger, embark on an extensive journey to India, Malaysia, and Indonesia, or what today is Malaysia and Indonesia. At the time, that was all part of the British Empire and of the Dutch East Indies, Dutch colonies. You already know that I really like ships, and I told you that every class we're going to talk either about a ship or a train or some mode of transportation. And I want to spend a minute to talk about the ship on which they traveled to, Malaysia and Singapore. They traveled aboard the steamer of the Norddeutsche Lloyd, which was a steamship company located in Bremen. And the ship was called SS Steamship Prinz Eitel Friedrich, which is an imperial mail steamer that had been built in 1904 to serve on the routes of the Norddeutsche Lloyd to the Far East, including the German concession of Jiaozhou or Kiaozhou, it's usually referred to in German, and its capital Tsingtao or Qingdao, that existed from 1898 to 1914. And here on the right, you have his route through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, Red Sea, Arabian Sea to India, and then eventually to Singapore. Now, what about that German steamer? What about those German concessions in China? What about that fascination with the East, the Far East, the South Asian islands? You remember from last week that Berlin in the 1880s was, I quote our narrator in Maihime, middle of this most modern of European capitals, right? So following the unification of Germany in 1870, the German Empire under Bismarck's leadership becomes a major military and industrial nation in Europe. And it actually starts to upset the balance of power in Europe, especially after Wilhelm II becomes emperor of the new German Empire in 1888. And Germany, on top of sort of being an industrial power and a military power, also begins to become an colonial power. It seeks what at the time was referred to as a place in the sun, ein Platz an der Sonne, seeing overseas colonies as a true indication of having achieved modern nationhood. So as a result then, Wilhelm II embarks or joins this race of carving up the pieces of the globe that are still up for grabs. And that are certain territories in Africa. Of course, China is still being carved up. We talked a little bit about that last week. And some places in what is sometimes referred to as the South Seas or Polynesia. So you can see here in blue these dots. So these are German possessions. Here in China, it's too small to see. But on the Shandong Peninsula, and then here in what is today Polynesia. Oh, and then part of Papua New Guinea here. So this really then was driven by the new German emperor. And Bismarck actually was not very happy. And Bismarck and Wilhelm II didn't get along. Wilhelm II kind of sacked him. But it was very popular amongst the German population and German elites, who saw the acquisition of colonies as a way to protect trade, to safeguard raw materials, to find new export markets, and take advantage of opportunities for capital investment, which of course is very similar to Britain and France and the Netherlands, other colonial powers. So public opinion eventually arrived at an understanding that prestigious colonies went hand in hand with dreams of a high seas fleet. So Germany is also building up its fleet, its navy. And to get back to that ship then, you remember, was called Prinz Wilhelm Eitel Friedrich. Well, this fellow then, you have a picture here of him on the right, was the second son of Wilhelm II. So you see how this shipping company then, in a way to show its support of the emperor and the emperor's ambitions overseas, which of course also would have benefited a company like the Norddeutscher Lloyd, which probably had been given the contract to carry mail and to carry freight, honored this by naming its ship, one of its ships, after the second son of the emperor. So just a couple of words about how all this had come about. I think in previous weeks we've already talked a little bit about how this all started, this colonial enterprise. So in the 1600s, the Dutch and the British East India Companies, and later on some other European East India Companies, are founded as joint companies, shareholder companies. So these are private companies that are traded on the respective stock exchanges, and they start this very lucrative trade with the East. And they become so powerful that they eventually start to own large territories in India and in South Asia. They control currencies. Here on the right you have some coins that were minted by the British East India Company in India. So they eventually control large parts of these territories, cultivating cash crops. They employ private armies to protect their property. And then, for a number of reasons, both the Dutch East India Company in 1800 and then also the British East India Company in 1858 become nationalized. So they started out as private companies, but they become nationalized, and their possessions, their huge possessions, their landowning possessions, become part of their respective crowns, empires, right? Great Britain and the Netherlands. Now, the Dutch East Indies, and you have a map here on the right, what is today mostly Indonesia, were some of the most valuable colonies in terms of the revenue they generated for the colonial power. And that was especially due to the spices that were grown there. Now, the British were mostly in parts of Burma and what is now Malaysia, and they, especially since the middle of the 19th century, started to grow rubber there, which was actually native to Brazil, and which was an incredible important industrial product. We don't talk that much about it today because it's largely been replaced by artificial plastics and rubbers, but in the 19th century it was one of the most important commodity. So the British grow that mostly there, and again derive huge profits from that. Now, under British rule, immigration of Chinese and Indian, especially laborers, is encouraged to these places. You might remember from last week that China in the 19th century experiences some terrible civil wars. So there is actually a desire from people, especially in the South, to leave the country, to seek new opportunities elsewhere. And to some degree, these colonial possessions offered opportunities. Now, at the same time, of course, we mustn't forget that the colonial social order was very much based on rigid racial and social structures, And when I say opportunities, of course, opportunities, were somewhat limited, and the racism and these colonial and social hierarchies were very much enforced. Now, what has all that to do with Hermann Hesse then? Well, Hermann Hesse on his journey really travels right into the heart of this, the British and the Dutch colonial empire. And these travel accounts that we are reading for this, I think, engage with a lot of these topics in really interesting ways. So, what are some of the questions that we want to look at in our next course stream, and of course you in your reading responses? To what degree is the work a product of the language and culture that produced it, i.e. early 20th century Germany? Germany in the craze of this sort of, colonial enterprise of the German emperor. What kind of image does it project of the culture or country Hermann Hesse, or territory Hermann Hesse is traveling to? What larger socio-historic phenomenon is the work responding to or a product of? And then a little bit more specifically, why did a German writer travel to South Asia in 1911? Why did he write essays and poetry and later on even fiction about what he experienced? How does his work differ from readings of previous weeks, right? In terms of focus, style, audience, or whatever else you can think of. What does his work tell us about early 20th century Germany, South Asia, about the pre-World War I era? What kind of picture or critique does he paint of his times and the places he visits? And how do we as 21st century travelers react to Hermann Hesse's account? And here you have him on the right, painted by his friend Hans Sturzenegger, with whom he traveled to these places, with a Panama hat, probably sitting somewhere in Malaysia and reading a book and smoking a cigar. I will see you shortly for our second course stream.